You can't park here. This is handicap parking.
I have a handicap placard hanging right there.
You need to see proof you're actually disabled.
Proof? I'm in a wheelchair.
A lot of people fake disabilities to use these spots.
Are you seriously asking me to prove I'm disabled while I'm sitting in a wheelchair?
The evening of September 18th, 2024, found Marcus Thompson parking his adapted van in a designated handicapped space in front of a pharmacy on the main street of a busy commercial district, preparing to pick up a prescription his doctor had called in earlier that day. Marcus was a 34-year-old black man who had been paraplegic since a car accident 8 years before, an accident that had broken his spine at the T6 level and left him permanently using a wheelchair. He had spent years learning to navigate a world that wasn't designed for people with disabilities, developing routines and strategies that allowed him to maintain independence despite challenges he faced daily. But when Officer Craig Morrison approached Marcus's van and told him he couldn't park in a handicapped space despite Marcus sitting in a wheelchair and having a handicapped placard clearly visible hanging from the rearview mirror, a security camera mounted on the pharmacy building began recording an encounter that would expose years of bias, discrimination, and a complete failure by an officer to recognize the humanity and rights of a person he had sworn to protect. Marcus Thompson had grown up in a small town approximately 100 miles from where he now lived, son of a teacher and a nurse who had instilled in him a strong sense of justice and belief in working hard to achieve goals. Marcus had been an athlete in high school, playing basketball and running track with enough talent to earn an athletic scholarship to State University. He had planned to study engineering while playing college basketball, dreaming of a career designing medical equipment or assistive technology. But those plans had been shattered on a rainy March night during his freshman year when a drunk driver crossed the center line on a rural highway and collided head-on with the car where Marcus was a passenger. The accident killed Marcus's friend who was driving and left Marcus with a spinal cord injury. Doctors said it was complete, meaning he would never recover function below the injury line. Marcus spent 6 months in hospitals and rehabilitation facilities learning how to live in a wheelchair, how to transfer himself from chair to bed and back, how to navigate a world that had been designed assuming everyone could walk. The process was physically and emotionally brutal, filled with moments of despair when Marcus questioned whether life in a wheelchair was worth living. But with support from family and his own determination, Marcus eventually found a path forward. Marcus returned to college 2 years after the accident, this time focusing on computer science instead of engineering, because the curriculum was more accessible for someone with limited mobility. He graduated with honors despite having to constantly advocate for accommodations that allowed him to participate fully in his education. After graduation, Marcus secured a job as a software developer for a mid-sized tech startup that was committed to accessibility both in their products and in their hiring practices. He had been working there for 5 years, building a career and reputation as a talented programmer who also brought valuable perspective on designing technology that was usable by people with disabilities. Living with paraplegia required Marcus to develop resilience that went beyond what most people would ever experience. Each day brought challenges people without disabilities never considered, from ensuring bathrooms were accessible to navigating sidewalks that lacked appropriate ramps to dealing with strangers' assumptions about his capabilities. Marcus had become an advocate for disability rights in his community, working with city council to improve accessibility of public buildings and educating local businesses about importance of accommodations. He had learned to choose his battles carefully, to explain his needs patiently, even when confronting ignorance or hostility. But Marcus had also experienced discrimination that went beyond typical accessibility challenges. As a black man with a disability, he navigated the intersection of two types of bias that often amplified each other. People made assumptions about his intelligence, employment status, and even legitimacy of his disability based on race. Marcus had been stopped by police officers multiple times, stops that seemed motivated more by racial profiling than any legitimate violation. He had developed strategies for these interactions, maintaining composure, explaining his situation clearly, and documenting encounters when possible. Officer Craig Morrison of the City Police Department represented exactly the type of officer Marcus had learned to fear during the years since his accident. Morrison was a 14-year veteran who had developed a reputation among certain segments of the community as an officer who stopped people based on how they looked rather than what they had done. Morrison had grown up in a predominantly white suburb, son of a plumber and a secretary, had a worldview that was shaped by biases he had never critically examined. He saw certain types of people as suspicious by default, as likely to be involved in criminal activity, as deserving extra scrutiny. Morrison had a particular history of doubting the legitimacy of disability claims when those claims came from people of color. He had developed an unfounded conspiracy theory that many people with handicap placards weren't actually disabled, but were defrauding the system to get convenient parking. Morrison seemed to believe he could tell who was legitimately disabled simply by looking at them, ignoring the reality that many disabilities weren't visible and that it wasn't his job to question people's medical documentation. Over the years, Morrison had stopped multiple people parked in handicapped spaces, demanding they prove their disabilities in ways that were both humiliating and illegal. On the evening of September 18th, Morrison was patrolling the commercial district when he saw Marcus's van parking in a handicapped space in front of the pharmacy. Morrison watched as Marcus opened the side door of his adapted van and began the process of transferring himself from the driver's seat to the wheelchair that was stored in a special compartment. Marcus's van was equipped with hand controls that allowed him to drive without using his legs, a modification that had cost over $15,000, but that was essential to his independence. The handicapped placard was clearly visible hanging from the rearview mirror, a valid state-issued placard indicating Marcus had a legal right to park in designated spaces. But instead of simply acknowledging Marcus was legally parked and moving on, Morrison decided to investigate. There was something about seeing a young black man in a wheelchair that triggered Morrison's suspicion. Perhaps Morrison assumed Marcus was too young to be genuinely disabled. Perhaps he thought the wheelchair was a prop being used for fraud. Perhaps his racial bias simply made him see Marcus as suspicious regardless of clear evidence of disability. Whatever his reasoning, Morrison activated his body camera and approached Marcus's van with a posture and attitude that signaled this wasn't going to be a friendly or routine encounter. Marcus had just completed his transfer from the van to his wheelchair when Morrison approached, stopping approximately 6 feet from where Marcus was sitting, in the parking space clearly marked with the International Accessibility symbol painted in bright blue on the asphalt. Marcus looked up to see a uniformed officer watching him with an expression Marcus recognized immediately from countless previous encounters, a mixture of suspicion and authority, suggesting the officer had already decided something was wrong before any words were even exchanged. Morrison said, "You can't park here," with a tone that wasn't questioning, but declarative, as if it were established fact rather than legitimate question. Marcus felt a familiar sinking in his stomach, a combination of frustration and resignation that came from having to explain his existence and rights to an authority figure who should be protecting him rather than harassing him. He said politely he was parked in a handicapped space because he was paraplegic, that he had a valid handicapped placard displayed in his van, that he was completely within his rights to use this space. Marcus kept his voice calm and clear. Behavior he had learned through bitter experience was essential when dealing with law enforcement, while being black and having a disability, two characteristics that often made officers treat him as a suspect rather than a citizen. Morrison looked at Marcus's wheelchair, then at the van, then back at Marcus, with an expression suggesting skepticism rather than acceptance. He said he needed to see Marcus's handicapped placard and identification, that there were many people defrauding the system by using handicapped placards illegally. The request was delivered in a way that implied Marcus was probably one of these fraudulent people, despite the literal evidence sitting in front of Morrison in the form of a man in a wheelchair. Marcus pointed out the placard was visible through his van's windshield, clearly, hanging from the rearview mirror where it was supposed to be, but Morrison insisted Marcus needed to remove it and bring it to him for inspection. Marcus suppressed growing irritation and maneuvered his wheelchair back to the van, reaching through the open driver's window to retrieve the placard. The process was physically awkward because Marcus had to stretch from his chair while maintaining balance, an action that was more difficult than simply being able to stand and easily grab the item. Morrison watched without offering assistance, apparently indifferent to the extra effort his unnecessary request was requiring. Marcus finally retrieved the placard and handed it to Morrison, the laminated plastic clearly showing his name, issue date, expiration date, and unique identification number that could be verified through state database. Morrison examined the placard for an excessively long period of time, turning it over, studying it from multiple angles, as if searching for signs of counterfeiting in a document that was obviously genuine. He then said the placard appeared legitimate, but that he needed to see Marcus's driver's license to verify the placard actually belonged to him. Marcus explained his driver's license was in his wallet, which was in the van, that he would need to get back into the van to retrieve it. Morrison said, "Then do it," his tone suggesting Marcus's request for reasonable accommodation was somehow problematic rather than legitimate necessity. Marcus again maneuvered his wheelchair back to the van, this time having to transfer himself from the chair back into the driver's seat to reach his wallet, which was in the console. The transfer process was something Marcus did dozens of times a day, but still required significant effort and concentration, involving using his upper body strength to lift himself from the chair, pivot his body, and lower himself into the car seat, while his legs remained immobile and without function. Morrison watched the entire process without offering to help or acknowledging that his requests were forcing Marcus through unnecessary physical exertion. Marcus retrieved his wallet, transferred himself back to the wheelchair, and handed his driver's license to Morrison. The license clearly showed the same name that was on the handicapped placard, the same photo of Marcus, all the information necessary to verify he was the person authorized to use that placard. Morrison studied the license, then looked at Marcus, then back at the license, his expression still skeptical. He asked what Marcus's disability was, a question that was both inappropriate and potentially illegal, given that police officers didn't have authority to question the medical nature of people's disabilities when they had appropriate documentation. Marcus said he was paraplegic, that he had a spinal cord injury that resulted in paralysis from the waist down, that this was why he was in a wheelchair and why he had a valid handicapped placard. He kept his voice polite, but there was an edge of frustration beginning to leak through, a product of having to justify his existence and needs to an officer who was clearly questioning the legitimacy of his disability, despite all evidence to the contrary. Marcus added he was here simply to pick up a prescription from the pharmacy, that he hadn't violated any laws, that he would like to continue with his business. Morrison, instead of accepting Marcus's explanation and allowing him to go about his day, asked a question that revealed the depth of his bias and fundamental lack of understanding about disabilities. He asked how Marcus could be driving if he claimed to be paraplegic, the implication being that leg paralysis would somehow make it impossible to operate a vehicle. The question demonstrated Morrison's shocking ignorance about assistive technology and the fact that thousands of people with paraplegia drove independently using hand controls. It also revealed Morrison's underlying suspicion that Marcus was lying about his disability, that the wheelchair and placard were somehow elaborate props in a fraud scheme. Marcus explained patiently that his van was equipped with hand controls that allowed him to operate the accelerator and brake with his hands instead of feet, that this was standard equipment for people with spinal cord injuries that affected legs but left upper body function intact. He said if Morrison wanted to see the controls, he was welcome to look inside the van, though Marcus had no legal obligation to demonstrate his accommodation equipment to satisfy an officer's curiosity. Marcus was trying to remain cooperative despite the unfair treatment, hoping that by educating Morrison he could end the encounter and move on. But Morrison wasn't interested in being educated. He said he had seen many people trying to defraud the system, that Marcus seemed too healthy to be really disabled, that Morrison was just doing his job verifying handicapped. Parking rules were being followed appropriately. Every word of Morrison's response piled insult upon insult. The claim that Marcus seemed too healthy denying the visible reality of Marcus sitting in a wheelchair. The claim that Morrison was just doing his job, ignoring the fact his job didn't include harassing people with disabilities who were legally parked with appropriate documentation. Marcus told Morrison directly he was being discriminated against because of his disability, that Morrison had no legal reason to detain him or question the legitimacy of his placard when all appropriate documentation had been provided. Marcus noted he was sitting in a wheelchair in front of Morrison, that his van had clearly visible equipment for a disabled driver, that his placard was valid, that nothing about the situation justified the level of scrutiny Morrison was applying. Marcus asked directly whether Morrison stopped every person he saw using a handicapped space, or if there was something specific about Marcus that had triggered this unnecessary investigation. The question hung in the air, its implication clear to both men. Marcus was forcing Morrison to confront the possibility that racial bias was guiding his actions as much as or more than any legitimate concern about handicapped parking fraud. Morrison became visibly defensive, saying race had nothing to do with this, that he stopped many people of all races whom he suspected of using handicapped spaces inappropriately. But his denial rang hollow given the context of the situation, given he was detaining a man in a wheelchair with valid documentation while apparently searching for any reason to question the legitimacy of his disability. As the confrontation between Marcus and Morrison continued in the handicapped parking space, a small crowd of observers began forming. Multiple customers had emerged from nearby stores, attracted by the sound of raised voices and the unusual scene of a police officer apparently detaining a man in a wheelchair who was legally parked. Among the spectators was a woman named Jennifer Wu, a disability rights attorney who worked for a non-profit organization located 3 blocks away. Jennifer had been walking to her car after working late when she noticed the confrontation and immediately recognized what was happening as a potential violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Jennifer approached the scene and politely asked Morrison what the legal basis was for detaining Marcus. She identified herself as an attorney specializing in disability law and noted that based on what she had heard and observed, Marcus had provided all necessary documentation to establish his right to use the handicapped space. Jennifer said that continuing to detain him and question him about the nature of his disability constituted illegal harassment under federal and state statutes protecting people with disabilities from discrimination. Her voice was calm but authoritative, the tone of someone who knew the law intimately and wasn't intimidated by Morrison's badge. Morrison turned his attention to Jennifer, saying she needed to back up and allow him to do his job, that this was a law enforcement matter and not her business. Jennifer remained standing where she was and said that public harassment of a person with a disability was absolutely her business as a disability rights attorney and as a witness to potential illegal conduct by an officer. She added she was recording the encounter on her phone, a statement that made Morrison look down and notice that Jennifer indeed had her phone raised capturing video of the interaction. Morrison told Jennifer she wasn't allowed to record him, a claim that was legally false given that recording police officers conducting public duties in public spaces had been firmly established as a constitutionally protected right. Jennifer corrected Morrison politely but firmly, explaining she had every right to record a police officer in a public space conducting official duties, that multiple Supreme Court decisions had affirmed this right, and that any attempt to prevent her from recording would be a violation of her First Amendment rights. Morrison seemed unsettled by being challenged by a bystander who clearly knew the law better than he did, a situation that was compounded when other spectators also began recording the encounter on their phones. Marcus realized the dynamic of the situation had shifted, that the presence of witnesses and cameras made it less likely Morrison could escalate the encounter in ways that might have happened without observers. Morrison, finding himself now being watched and recorded by multiple people, tried to reassert control of the situation by demanding Marcus get out of his wheelchair to prove he really couldn't walk. The request was so outrageous, so fundamentally disrespectful of Marcus's dignity and the reality of his disability, that multiple spectators audibly gasped. Jennifer immediately declared loudly that what Morrison had just requested was completely illegal, that police officers had no authority to require people with disabilities to demonstrate the nature of their physical limitations, that this constituted discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. She addressed Morrison directly, saying if he continued with this line of questioning, she would personally ensure complaints were filed both with the police department and the Department of Justice. Marcus told Morrison with a voice that was now trembling with contained anger that he wasn't going to get out of his wheelchair, that he didn't need to prove his disability beyond the documentation he had already provided, that Morrison's request was degrading and illegal. Marcus added he had cooperated patiently with all of Morrison's reasonable requests, despite having no legal obligation to do so, but that he wasn't going to allow himself to be humiliated by an officer who was clearly operating on bias rather than legitimate police work. Marcus said if Morrison planned to cite him or arrest him, then Morrison should proceed with that, but otherwise Marcus was now going to retrieve his prescription from the pharmacy as he had originally planned. Morrison seemed torn between continuing the confrontation and backing down before the situation escalated further. He could see multiple people were recording, that there was an attorney present claiming his actions were illegal, that he had lost control of the narrative. Morrison finally told Marcus he was free to go, but added he would be watching to ensure Marcus wasn't abusing handicapped parking privileges. The comment was delivered with a threatening tone, the clear implication being Morrison planned to continue harassing Marcus in future encounters. Marcus didn't respond, simply collected his handicapped placard and driver's license from Morrison and began maneuvering his chair toward the pharmacy. Jennifer approached Marcus as he was rolling away from Morrison and said she had captured the entire encounter on video, that she would like to give her contact information to Marcus in case he wanted to file a complaint or needed legal representation. Marcus thanked Jennifer sincerely, accepting her business card and saying he would definitely consider his options. Other spectators approached to express support, with multiple people offering to serve as witnesses if Marcus decided to take action against Morrison. The support from strangers was emotionally powerful for Marcus, who had spent so much of his life facing discrimination, alone, without allies. Marcus proceeded into the pharmacy to pick up his prescription, but the experience of being publicly questioned and humiliated by Morrison left him shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he signed for his medication, a product of adrenaline and anger he had suppressed during the confrontation. The pharmacist, who had witnessed a portion of the encounter through the store window, expressed sympathy and said she had seen the officer harassing Marcus and thought the behavior was completely inappropriate. She said if Marcus needed a statement from her about what she witnessed, she was willing to provide one. Morrison watched from a distance as Marcus exited the pharmacy and returned to his van. The officer remained in the area for another 10 minutes, apparently lingering or hoping Marcus would commit some violation that would justify stopping him again. But Marcus simply transferred himself back into his van, stored his wheelchair, and began driving away. As he pulled out of the parking space, Marcus noticed Morrison watching him intently, a look that felt both threatening and deeply personal. Marcus recognized this probably wouldn't be the last time he had an encounter with this particular officer, that Morrison had demonstrated the type of persistent bias that wouldn't disappear, simply because he had been challenged once. The video Jennifer had recorded of the encounter was uploaded to social media that same evening. Jennifer had asked Marcus's permission before posting, explaining she thought public documentation of Morrison's conduct was important both for accountability and to educate others about the type of discrimination people with disabilities faced. Marcus agreed, recognizing that while exposing himself publicly was uncomfortable, it was also potentially necessary if any change was going to happen. Jennifer posted the video with a detailed caption explaining the context, identifying Marcus only by first name to protect his privacy while naming Morrison because he was a public official conducting official duties. The video clearly showed the sequence of events, from Morrison's initial requests for documentation through his outrageous question demanding Marcus leave his wheelchair to prove his disability. Audio captured Morrison's tone, his comments questioning the legitimacy of Marcus's disability despite obvious evidence, and his attempt to prevent recording. The video also showed multiple bystanders intervening, particularly Jennifer correcting Morrison's legally false claims and declaring his conduct constituted illegal discrimination. The clarity of the video evidence made it impossible for Morrison's defenders to argue there had been a misunderstanding or that Marcus had provoked the confrontation. Jennifer's video of the confrontation between Marcus and Morrison went viral within 12 hours, accumulating over 2 million views and being shared across multiple social media platforms. Hashtags like disabled, isn't fraud, and justice for Marcus began trending as people expressed outrage about Marcus's treatment by Morrison. Comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Marcus and condemnatory of Morrison, with many people with disabilities sharing their own stories of being questioned about the legitimacy of their disabilities by police officers, parking attendants, and strangers who felt entitled to judge who deserved to use disability accommodations. Local media quickly identified both Marcus and Morrison from the video. Within 24 hours, multiple news stations had reported the story, identifying Morrison as a 14-year officer with the city police department. News reporting included not just Jennifer's video, but also interviews with other spectators who had witnessed the Confrontation, including the pharmacist who confirmed Marcus had been a long-time customer, who had always been polite, and who clearly had a legitimate disability that justified his use of handicapped parking. The police department was immediately flooded with calls and emails from people demanding Morrison face discipline for his conduct. Disability rights organizations across the state released statements condemning Morrison's actions and calling for a full investigation. Jennifer Wu, the attorney who had recorded the encounter, gave multiple media interviews explaining precisely which laws Morrison had violated by questioning the legitimacy of Marcus's disability and demanding he leave his wheelchair. Jennifer emphasized this wasn't simply an officer being overly zealous, but was illegal discrimination against a person with a disability protected under multiple federal and state statutes. Police Chief Daniel Roberts convened a press conference 2 days after the video went viral. Roberts said the department was conducting a full investigation of Morrison's conduct, that they were taking the allegations extremely seriously, and that if the investigation determined policies or laws were violated, appropriate disciplinary action would be taken. Roberts acknowledged the video showed an encounter that was deeply concerning and didn't reflect the department's values or training. He announced Morrison had been placed on administrative leave while the investigation was conducted. Marcus, after consulting with Jennifer Wu and carefully considering his options, decided to file formal complaints, both with the police department and with the city's Human Rights Commission. The complaint detailed how Morrison had detained him without probable cause, questioned the legitimacy of his disability despite valid documentation, demanded he demonstrate his disability in degrading ways, and threatened continued harassment in future encounters. Marcus also filed a complaint with the Department of Justice alleging Morrison's conduct violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and other federal civil rights statutes. The police department's internal affairs investigation moved quickly given the clarity of video evidence. Investigators interviewed Marcus, Jennifer, and multiple other spectators who had witnessed the confrontation. They reviewed not just Jennifer's video, but also Morrison's body camera footage, which he had activated at the beginning of the encounter, but had apparently forgotten was recording, as he made increasingly inappropriate requests. Body camera footage provided additional perspective on the encounter, capturing Morrison's exact words and tone in ways that completely supported Marcus's account. Investigators also reviewed Morrison's records and discovered a troubling pattern of behavior. Over the previous 5 years, Morrison had received 7 citizen complaints, alleging he had inappropriately questioned the legitimacy of people's disabilities or stopped people using handicapped parking without appropriate justification. Each previous complaint had been minimally investigated and dismissed as a misunderstanding or difference in perception, but when investigators looked at the cases collectively in light of Marcus's video, a pattern of disability discrimination became undeniable. The internal affairs investigation revealed Morrison had undergone mandatory training on the Americans with Disabilities Act and rights of people with disabilities, but that he had apparently completely ignored that training in practice. Morrison's supervisors were interviewed and multiple admitted they had received informal complaints about Morrison questioning people with disabilities, but had dismissed the complaints as Morrison being overly diligent rather than discriminatory. The supervisor's failure to recognize and address Morrison's pattern of behavior was identified as a contributing factor that had allowed his discrimination to continue unchecked for years. Investigators contacted all 7 people who had previously filed complaints against Morrison related to disability issues. 5 of these people agreed to give new interviews detailing their experiences. The stories were remarkably similar to Marcus's experience. One woman in her 50s with multiple sclerosis described Morrison stopping her and demanding she explain precisely what physical limitations she had, despite having a valid handicapped placard. A man with a prosthetic leg that wasn't visible under his pants described Morrison questioning whether he was really disabled because he didn't look like anything was wrong with him. Particularly damning was the account of a 29-year-old woman, veteran with a traumatic brain injury from her military service. She described Morrison stopping her, questioning the legitimacy of her disability because she looked young and healthy, and then suggesting she was probably just using an older relative's handicapped placard to get convenient parking. When she had shown military identification and explained her injury, Morrison had apparently said many veterans exaggerated injuries to get benefits, The comment had been so offensive and painful that she had filed a formal complaint, but that complaint had been dismissed after a superficial investigation. Concluded Morrison had simply been doing his job. The district attorney's office reviewed evidence from Marcus's case and determined that while Morrison's conduct was clearly inappropriate and possibly illegal under civil rights statutes, there was no basis for criminal charges because Morrison had been acting under color of authority and hadn't committed a specific act that qualified as a crime under state penal code. The decision not to criminally prosecute Morrison was disappointing for Marcus and his advocates, but wasn't unexpected given the standard for criminal charges against police officers was notoriously high. However, the district attorney's office referred the case to the United States Attorney and Department of Justice to consider federal civil rights charges. Federal prosecutors had authority to prosecute officers who willfully deprive people of constitutional rights under color of law, a standard Morrison's conduct could potentially meet. The Department of Justice opened a preliminary investigation of Morrison, but indicated the process would take multiple months to complete, given the volume of cases they were handling. The city's Human Rights Commission conducted a public hearing on Marcus's complaint approximately 6 weeks after the incident. The hearing attracted significant media and public attention, with the hearing room packed with disability rights advocates, community members, and reporters. Marcus testified about his experience, describing not just the specific encounter with Morrison, but also the broader impact discrimination had on his life. He explained that, as a person with a visible disability, he faced constant questioning of his authority to exist in public spaces, that each encounter like the one with Morrison eroded his sense of safety and belonging. Jennifer Wu testified about what she had witnessed and provided legal analysis of precisely which laws Morrison had violated. She explained the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits public entities from discriminating against people with disabilities, and that this included police officers harassing people simply because they had disabilities. Jennifer noted Morrison's request for Marcus to leave his wheelchair to prove his disability was particularly egregious because it was both degrading and completely unnecessary, given Marcus had provided all legally required documentation. Multiple other witnesses testified about their own experiences with Morrison. The pattern that emerged from testimony was clear and consistent. Morrison had a history of targeting people with disabilities, particularly those whose disabilities weren't immediately obvious, or those who were young enough that Morrison assumed they couldn't be legitimately disabled. Testimony also revealed Morrison seemed to have a particular bias against people of color with disabilities, questioning their legitimacy more frequently and more aggressively than he questioned white people with disabilities. The police union sent a representative to the hearing to defend Morrison, arguing he had simply been doing his job, verifying handicapped parking rules were being followed appropriately. The union representative claimed there was a significant problem with handicapped parking fraud, and that officers had a responsibility to investigate suspicious use of handicapped placards. But the argument collapsed under questioning when the commission asked precisely what had been suspicious about a man in a wheelchair with a valid handicapped placard using a handicapped space, a question the union representative couldn't answer convincingly. The Human Rights Commission issued findings approximately 2 weeks after the hearing. The commission concluded Morrison had violated Marcus's rights under the city's anti-discrimination laws by detaining him without appropriate justification, questioning the legitimacy of his disability despite valid documentation, and demanding he demonstrate his disability in degrading ways. The commission recommended the police department terminate Morrison's employment, and that the city implement comprehensive disability rights training for all officers. The commission also recommended the city review all previous complaints against Morrison and consider reopening cases where people may have been inappropriately cited or arrested. The police department held its own internal disciplinary hearing 3 weeks after the Human Rights Commission issued its findings. The hearing was conducted by a panel of 3 senior officers, including an assistant chief and 2 commanders who reviewed all evidence from the internal affairs investigation. Morrison was represented by a union attorney who argued he had simply made an error in judgment rather than engaged in deliberate misconduct, that he deserved a chance to complete additional training and remain employed. But the weight of evidence against Morrison was overwhelming, not just the video of the encounter with Marcus, but a documented pattern of similar behavior extending over years. The disciplinary panel concluded Morrison had violated multiple department policies, including those related to respectful treatment of citizens, non-discrimination, and appropriate use of police authority. The panel determined Morrison's violations were serious enough to justify termination, particularly given he had received training on disability rights and had been previously warned about citizen complaints. Chief Roberts accepted the panel's recommendation and officially terminated Morrison's employment, a decision that was announced at a press conference where Roberts emphasized the department had zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Morrison attempted to appeal the termination through the union grievance process, arguing he was being scapegoated to appease public pressure. The union represented him vigorously during the grievance arbitration process, but the independent arbitrator who reviewed the case concluded termination was appropriate, given the severity and pattern of Morrison's misconduct. The arbitrator noted the video of the encounter with Marcus unequivocally showed Morrison engaging in the disability discrimination, that the discovery of multiple similar previous cases established a pattern, and that termination was proportionate to the seriousness of the violations. Marcus filed a civil lawsuit against Morrison personally and against the city under a theory the city had failed to appropriately train and supervise officers about disability rights. The lawsuit alleged violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Rehabilitation Act, and state civil rights statutes. Attorneys representing Marcus included Jennifer Wu and two other disability rights attorneys from a firm that specialized in discrimination cases. They argued the city had been deliberately indifferent to Morrison's pattern of misconduct, despite multiple previous complaints alerting them to the problem. The city initially tried to defend the lawsuit by arguing Morrison had acted outside the scope of his employment and that the city shouldn't be held liable for his discriminatory actions. But during discovery, Marcus's attorneys obtained internal records showing supervisors had been repeatedly alerted to Morrison's behavior, but had failed to take appropriate corrective action. Emails between supervisors discussing complaints about Morrison referred to him as being overly zealous rather than recognizing his behavior constituted illegal discrimination. The supervisor's failure to address the problem created liability for the city. The city eventually agreed to a substantial settlement totaling $350,000. The settlement covered not just compensatory damages for Marcus for violation of his rights and emotional distress, but also included a commitment by the city to implement comprehensive police training reforms on disability rights. As part of the settlement, the city agreed to bring in Jennifer Wu and other disability rights attorneys as consultants to develop and deliver mandatory training for all officers. The city also agreed to establish a specific review process for complaints related to disability discrimination to ensure future complaints were taken seriously. Marcus used a portion of his settlement to establish a scholarship fund providing financial assistance to college students with physical disabilities studying computer science or related fields. He named the scholarship after the friend who had died in the car accident that left Marcus paraplegic, a way to honor his friend's memory while creating opportunities for other young people with disabilities. Marcus also donated a portion of the settlement to disability rights organizations that had supported him during the case, including the nonprofit organization where Jennifer worked. Morrison's life after termination remained difficult. He attempted to secure law enforcement positions in multiple other jurisdictions, but his termination for disability discrimination and the media attention the case received made him essentially unemployable in law enforcement. Morrison eventually accepted a position in private security, paying significantly less than his previous police salary. The loss of his law enforcement career and associated income had substantial financial impact on his family, forcing them to sell their house and move to a less expensive neighborhood. Marcus returned to his work as a software developer, but found the experience with Morrison had left a lasting impact. He developed heightened anxiety about parking in handicapped spaces, even when using his own designated space, always worried someone would question the legitimacy of his disability. Marcus began therapy sessions to process the trauma of being publicly humiliated and discriminated against, working through feelings of anger and violation he had suppressed during the confrontation. His therapist helped Marcus understand his emotional reactions were normal and valid, that experiencing discrimination while having a disability constituted genuine trauma that deserved professional attention. Marcus became a public advocate for disability rights, using his platform to educate others about discrimination people with disabilities faced. He spoke at multiple conferences about his case, emphasizing that disability discrimination often intersected with racial discrimination in ways that amplified harm to people with multiple marginalized identities. Marcus also worked with state legislators on a bill that would strengthen protections for people with disabilities and increase accountability for public officials who discriminated against people with disabilities. Video of Marcus's encounter with Morrison remained online and continued being shared years after the original incident. The footage became a training tool used in police academies and diversity training programs across the country, an example of how unchecked bias and lack of understanding about disabilities could lead to illegal discrimination. Training developed around the case included not just the video, but interviews with Marcus and Jennifer discussing the impact of disability discrimination and the importance of law enforcement, respecting the rights of people with disabilities. Jennifer Wu used the case's visibility to launch a national awareness campaign about handicapped parking discrimination and broader bias against people with disabilities. Her organization created resources for people with disabilities about their rights when interacting with law enforcement, including information about what officers could and couldn't legally ask about people's disabilities. Jennifer also worked with disability organizations across the country to create a support network for people who experienced similar discrimination, connecting victims with legal resources and emotional support. 5 years after the incident, Marcus remained at the same software development job, having been promoted to a leadership position where he supervised a team of programmers. He continued advocating for disability rights, but also found peace in focusing on positive aspects of his life, including his relationship with a partner he met through a disability advocacy group. Marcus still occasionally thought about Morrison and wondered whether the officer had genuinely learned anything from the experience or simply resented being held accountable. But he had made peace with not knowing the answer. The story of Marcus exposing Morrison remained in public consciousness as an example of how people with disabilities frequently face discrimination and questioning of their authority to exist in public spaces. The case demonstrated that even with obvious evidence of disability and appropriate legal documentation, people with disabilities still face doubt and harassment from authority figures. But it also showed accountability was possible when victims had support from allies like Jennifer, and when evidence was clear enough to make denial impossible.